The conquest of the Gansu corridor did not begin with a quest for luxury, but with a desperate military need for bone and muscle. In 138 BCE, the Han Dynasty faced an existential threat from the Xiongnu, nomadic archers who struck from the Mongolian steppe with a mobility the Chinese infantry could not match. Emperor Wu required a weapon that could outrun the wind, the heavenly horses of the Fergana Valley. These stallions, rumored to sweat blood and possess endurance far beyond the local pony breeds, were the catalyst for the most ambitious logistical expansion in the ancient world. To reach them, the Han military had to project power through the Hushi Corridor, a narrow throat of habitable land squeezed between the Gobi Desert and the Tibetan Plateau. This was not a voyage of discovery. It was a scorched earth campaign to secure a supply line that stretched over 4,000 miles. The Silk Road was born from the grit of iron and the necessity of horse armor. The sheer scale of this undertaking defies modern logistics. A single caravan moving west from Chang'an faced a gauntlet of 3,000 miles before reaching the markets of Central Asia. The physical threats were absolute. To the north lay the shifting dunes of the Taklamakan, a desert whose name translates to, "Once you go in, you do not come out." To the south, the Kunlun Mountains rose as a wall of frozen granite, where oxygen deprivation thinned the blood and killed pack animals by the hundreds. Nomadic raids were not a possibility. They were a mathematical certainty. Survival depended on the garrison system, a series of watchtowers and fortified granaries built at 20-mile intervals, the distance a laden camel can travel in a single day. Dehydration was the primary executioner, as water sources were often bitter with salt or hidden deep beneath the gravel crust of the desert floor. Before we delve into the mechanics of this ancient machine, tell us where you're watching from. What time is it for you? The air in the Hushi corridor is bone-dry, smelling of dust and sun-baked brick. The search for the heavenly horses forced the Han to engineer a massive logistical bridge across the wastes. General Li Guangli led 60,000 men across the Pamir Mountains, not to explore, but to seize the Fergana breeding stock by force. His army carried their own water and skins and relied on thousands of oxen to pull siege engines over mountain passes. When the local kings refused to trade, the Han redirected entire river systems to starve the city of its water supply. This was the brutal reality of early trade. It was an extension of state violence. The horses were eventually secured, but the cost was a trail of bleached bones stretching back to the Central Plains. The Great Wall was extended not just to keep people out, but to protect the investment flowing in, the horses moving east and the silk moving west to pay for them. Engineering the route required the transformation of the landscape. Every 20 miles, a beacon tower was erected, manned by conscripted soldiers who spent their lives staring at the horizon for the dust clouds of Xiongnu riders. These men survived on parched grain and vinegar, their hands calloused from the constant maintenance of crossbows and stone fortifications. The Silk Road was not a single path, but a shifting network of tracks determined by the location of wells and the movement of enemy tribes. It was a machine that consumed resources to produce profit. A merchant did not simply walk to Rome. He moved goods from one fortified node to the next, paying protection taxes at every gate. The sound of the route was the rhythmic clanking of iron bit rings against the teeth of 1,000 horses. Success in this environment was measured in calories and liters. A caravan of 50 camels required nearly 2,000 liters of water every 3 days. In the salt flats of the Lop Nur, where no standing water exists, the Han engineers dug Keres systems, underground tunnels that tapped into glacial melt from the mountains, preventing evaporation in the searing heat. This was the infrastructure of empire. Without these tunnels, the Silk Road would have been a graveyard within a single season. The military protected the water, and the water allowed the trade to breathe. The transition from a local conflict to a global trade network was a physical manifestation of imperial will. In the darkness of the mountain passes, a soldier tightens the leather straps on a supply crate. Crossing the Darim Basin is a feat of thermal endurance. The basin is a vast, bowl-shaped depression in the Earth's crust, shielded by the highest mountains in the world. It is a place of atmospheric extremes where the temperature swings 60 degrees between midday and midnight. Trade here followed two distinct tracks. the northern route along the Celestial Mountains and the southern route hugging the foothills of Tibet. Both were defined by the physics of the void. There is no middle ground in the Taklamakan. If a traveler leaves the string of oases, they are entering a vacuum of resources. The ground is a mix of fine, powdery silt and sharp, volcanic gravel that shreds leather saws in a matter of weeks. To move goods here, the Han and local kingdoms had to master the engineering of the oasis. The oasis was the engine room of the Silk Road. Places like Turpan and Dunhuang were not just rest stops. They were industrial hubs where thousands of camels were reshod, and leather harnesses were repaired using animal glues and iron rivets. The engineering of the Karai system reached its peak here. By digging vertical shafts every few dozen meters and connecting them with a gently sloping horizontal tunnel, engineers harnessed gravity to pull water from the mountain aquifers into the desert floor. This allowed for the cultivation of grapes, melons, and grain in a landscape that receives less than an inch of rain per year. These green islands were heavily fortified, with high mud brick walls designed to withstand long sieges and the abrasive force of sandstorms that could strip paint from wood in hours. Logistics in the Darim Basin revolved around the camel, specifically the Bactrian camel. This animal is a biological machine designed for the Silk Road. Its two humps store fat that can be converted into metabolic water, and its thick pads allow it to walk on soft sand where a horse would founder. A single Bactrian camel can carry up to 500 pounds of cargo. In the winter, their fur grows into a thick, matted coat to withstand sub-zero temperatures. In the summer, they shed it in clumps. The smell of a caravan is the pungent, oily odor of wet camel fur and the acrid smoke of dried dung fires. This animal was the only reason silk could move across the void. It was the heavy-lift vehicle of antiquity, moving at a constant, grueling pace of 2.5 miles per hour. The physics of desert crossing meant that weight was the enemy. High-value, low-mass goods were the only cargo that made economic sense. Silk, being light, durable, and immensely valuable, became the primary currency of the route. It was packed in tight, waterproof bundles of oiled leather. Alongside it moved jade from the rivers of Khotan, prized for its hardness and used for ritual weaponry and imperial seals. These materials were the physical manifestations of wealth, but they were also burdens. Every pound of jade meant a pound less of water or grain. The math of survival was constant and unforgiving. A caravan leader's primary tool was not a map, but a deep knowledge of the specific gravity of his cargo and the remaining capacity of his animals. Military control of the Darim Basin was a game of fortress and well. The Han established the protectorate of the western regions to ensure that no single nomadic tribe could monopolize the water sources. They built the Jade Gate, a massive fortress at the western edge of the Hushi Corridor, which served as the ultimate checkpoint. Nothing moved west without imperial clearance, and nothing moved east without paying the toll. The gate was a bottleneck, a physical choke point where the vastness of the desert was funneled into a single, controllable corridor. Beyond the gate, the wind howled through the ruined towers of previous expeditions. A merchant stops to scrape the salt crust from his wooden water flask. To conquer the sand, one must understand the movement of the dunes. In the Taklamakan, megadunes can reach heights of 300 meters, shifting and swallowing entire cities over the course of decades. The Silk Road was not a paved highway. It was a series of navigational markers, piles of stones, bleached animal skulls, and the ruins of abandoned towers. Engineering here meant creating stability in a fluid environment. The Han military used reeds and tamarisk branches layered with gravel to build sand dikes that redirected the wind, preventing the burial of crucial roads. This was a constant battle of maintenance, requiring a permanent labor force of thousands of conscripts who lived in semi-subterranean pits to escape the heat. The physics of the sandstorm, or boron, presented a lethal obstacle. These storms can last for days, creating a total blackout where the sun is obscured by a wall of fine dust. The abrasive force is enough to blind a horse or human if they are not shielded. Caravans would huddle in a circle, tying the camels together in a tight knot and burying their faces in their cloaks. Survival depended on the physical integrity of the gear, the strength of the ropes, the thickness of the tents, and the airtightness of the water skins. If a water skin leaked during a 3-day storm, the entire caravan was condemned. The grit of the sand found its way into everything: the food, the eyes, and the moving parts of crossbow triggers. Tactically, the desert was a landscape of ambush. Nomadic raiders, such as the Xiongnu and later the Hephthalites, did not attack the fortified oases directly. Instead, they struck the caravans in the long stretches between water holes. Their tactics were based on the superior range of the composite bow and the speed of the Mongolian pony. To counter this, the trade caravans adopted a military formation. They moved in brigades of several hundred camels, protected by hired mercenaries or imperial guards. These guards wore laminated leather armor, which was lighter and more breathable than iron in the desert heat, yet strong enough to deflect an arrow at a distance. The Silk Road was a moving fortress, a slow-motion convoy through hostile territory. The economics of the sand were driven by the cost of replacement. A camel that died in the desert was a lost investment that could take years to replace. Thus, the route was serviced by a secondary industry of animal husbandry and veterinary care. In oases like Kutcha, specialist camel doctors used cauterization and herbal poultices to treat the sores caused by heavy packs. The physical reality of the trade was the constant maintenance of living tissue. If the animals failed, the goods stayed in the sand. The wealth of the East depended entirely on the health of a beast of burden's feet. Every evening, the caravan leaders would inspect the hooves of their animals by the light of a flickering grease lamp. As the route pushed further west, it encountered the singing sands of Dunhuang. The movement of the dunes created a low-frequency hum that many travelers found disorienting. But for the engineers and scouts, these sounds were indicators of wind direction and impending weather changes. They used the environment as a sensory map. The engineering of the Silk Road was as much about psychological endurance as it was about physical infrastructure. The road was a test of the human body's ability to withstand the friction of the earth. At the edge of a dried-up riverbed, a scout hammers a wooden stake into the shifting ground to mark the path. Beyond the deserts lay the Pamir Mountains, known to ancient travelers as the Onion Mountains for the wild plants that grew on their slopes, or more accurately, the roof of the world. This is where the Silk Road reached its physical limit. The Pamir Knot is a massive geological collision where the Himalayas, the Karakoram, the Hindu Kush, and the Tian Shan ranges meet. To cross it, caravans had to navigate passes at elevations exceeding 15,000 feet. At this altitude, the physical mechanics of transport changed. Camels, despite their hardiness, struggled in the thin air. The temperature could drop to 40 degrees below zero, freezing the moisture in a man's breath into icicles on his beard. The engineering of mountain transit involved staircase roads, carved directly into the cliff faces. In some sections, these roads were nothing more than wooden beams driven into holes drilled into the rock, covered with brushwood and soil. One false step by a pack animal would send hundreds of pounds of silk and the animal itself plummeting into the abyss. There was no recovery of lost goods in the Pamirs. The logistics of the climb required a change in power. The Bactrian camel was often swapped for the yak or the mountain pony, animals with higher lung capacity and better traction on ice. This swap took place in transfer hubs, like Kashgar, which sat at the western edge of the desert and the foot of the mountains. The mountain passes were also the ultimate military choke points. A handful of men could hold a narrow gorge against an entire army. Empires like the Kushans rose to power by controlling these gates. They built stone fortresses that clung to the ridges, overlooking the winding paths below. Their power was derived from the rite of passage. They didn't need to produce goods. They only needed to control the ground they stood on. They collected tolls in the form of gold, silver, and the very goods the merchants carried. The physical reality of power in the Pamirs was the stone wall and the archer's nest. The air up here was so cold it felt like inhaling shards of glass. The physiology of the high-altitude crossing was a silent killer. Travelers suffered from mountain sickness, the thinning of the blood, and the swelling of the brain. Without the modern understanding of oxygen, they attributed the symptoms to poisonous vapors or malevolent spirits. But the physical result was the same: exhaustion, confusion, and death. To survive, they moved with agonizing slowness, taking days to ascend a single ridge. They consumed high-fat diets of yak butter and parched grain, to keep their internal fires burning. The Silk Road at this point was a test of the heart and lungs, a vertical marathon where the prize was simply the ability to descend into the valleys of the West. Descending the western slopes of the Pamirs brought the caravans into the Tokaristan and the Fergana Valley. This was the transition from the high-altitude void to the lush river valleys of the Amu Darya. The change in air pressure and temperature was immediate. The stone of the mountains gave way to the lush soil of the plains. This was the territory of the Great Yuezhi, a nomadic people who had been pushed west by the Han expansion and had carved out their own empire. They were the new gatekeepers, the first of the great middlemen who would define the next phase of the Silk Road. In the shadow of a towering peak, a traveler ties a scrap of red cloth to a cairn to mark his survival. As the Silk Road matured, the oases of the Darim Basin transformed from simple military outposts into sophisticated urban machines. Cities like Naya, Lulan, and Miran were built on a foundation of intensive hydraulic engineering. Because the water supply was seasonal, dependent on the summer melt of the mountain glaciers, the cities were designed around massive reservoir systems. These were not just open ponds. They were covered cisterns lined with waterproof bitumen to prevent loss. The layout of the city was dictated by the flow of water. The elite lived upstream, while the industrial zones, tanneries, metalsmiths, and dye works were located downstream. This was a physical hierarchy of resource access. The construction of these cities relied on rammed earth technology. In a landscape where timber was scarce, engineers used wooden forms to compress layers of local soil mixed with straw and lime. When dried by the desert sun, these walls became as hard as concrete, capable of withstanding the battering of sand-laden winds and the tremors of frequent earthquakes. The walls of a city like Gaochang were over 10 meters thick at the base, providing thermal mass that kept the interior cool during the day and warm at night. These cities were artificial ecosystems, sustained only by the constant maintenance of the water channels. If the channel was blocked or diverted by an enemy, the city died in weeks. The logistics of the caravanserai were perfected here. A caravanserai was a standardized roadside and designed to house hundreds of animals and their handlers. It was a fortress hotel with a single massive gate that was locked at sunset. Inside, a central courtyard held the livestock, while the perimeter was lined with 2 stories of rooms. The lower floor was for heavy cargo, silk bales, iron ingots, and spice crates, while the upper floor housed the merchants. This layout was a physical security system. By centralizing the wealth in the center of a stone and mud brick structure, the risk of theft was minimized. The smell of these places was a thick cocktail of wood smoke, roasting mutton, and animal waste. The oasis cities served as value-added hubs. Raw silk arriving from the east was often dyed or woven into more complex patterns using local techniques before being sent further west. This increased the profit margin and reduced the weight of the cargo. Physical objects tell the story of this industrial exchange. Glass shards from Rome found in the ruins of Naya, and Chinese bronze mirrors discovered in the graves of local chieftains. These objects were not symbols. They were the physical components of a global supply chain. The cities were the gears in this machine, turning the raw energy of the desert caravans into refined wealth. The ultimate fate of these cities was tied to the physical environment. As the climate shifted and the rivers changed course, the cities were abandoned. The sand did not just cover them, it preserved them. Today, the ruins of Lulan stand as sun-bleached skeletons of a once thriving logistical hub. The wooden beams, preserved by the absolute lack of moisture, still show the marks of the adzes used to shape them 2,000 years ago. The physical reality of the Silk Road is nowhere more apparent than in these ghost cities, where the silence is only broken by the sifting of sand through empty doorways. A dry wind rattles the desiccated remains of a grapevine in a courtyard. By the 1st century BCE, the Silk Road hit a massive political and physical barrier in the west, the Parthian Empire. Centered in modern-day Iran, the Parthians were the ultimate middlemen. They occupied the Iranian plateau, a rugged landscape of salt deserts and jagged mountains that sat squarely across the trade routes to the Mediterranean. The Parthians did not want to trade with Rome, they wanted to tax Rome. Their power was built on a foundation of iron and horseflesh. Unlike the light cavalry of the steppes, the Parthian Cataphracts, were heavy shock troops, with both man and horse encased in scales of polished iron. This was the military machine that dictated the terms of trade for centuries. The logistics of Parthian control were focused on the Royal Road, an ancient Persian highway system they had inherited and improved. This road ran from the heart of Mesopotamia to the borders of India. To ensure their monopoly, the Parthians established a rigid system of internal customs. They forbade Chinese merchants from traveling further west and Roman merchants from traveling further east. All goods had to change hands in Parthian markets like Hecatompylos or Ctesiphon. This physical decoupling of the supply chain allowed the Parthians to mark up the price of silk by as much as 1,000%. They turned the geography of the Iranian plateau into a profit-generating engine. The physical reality of Parthian power was the mastery of the composite bow fired from horseback, the Parthian shot. Their military tactics were designed to protect their borders from Roman expansion. When the Roman general Crassus attempted to invade Parthia in 53 BCE, his legions were decimated at the Battle of Carrhae. The Parthians used a camel-mounted supply train to provide a constant stream of fresh arrows to their horse archers, allowing them to maintain a barrage that the Roman shields could not withstand. This was a victory of logistics. By ensuring their archers never ran out of ammunition, the Parthians maintained their Iron Curtain and kept the silk profits flowing into their own treasuries. The Roman obsession with silk became a physical drain on their economy. Roman senators complained that the empire was being emptied of its gold to pay for a fabric that was literally transparent. The material reality of silk, its sheen, its softness, and its status, made it an addictive commodity. The Parthians took Roman gold and silver and used it to fuel their own imperial expansion. They built massive fortifications along the Zagros Mountains to ensure no unauthorized caravan could bypass their checkpoints. Every bale of silk that reached the Mediterranean was a testament to Parthian logistical dominance. The scent of the Parthian court was the heavy aroma of frankincense and the metallic tang of oiled armor. The Parthian landscape was dominated by the Khanate, another sophisticated irrigation system similar to the Karais. These tunnels allowed for the survival of large urban populations in the middle of the desert. The cities were built of fire-hardened brick, with massive arched gateways that served as the collection points for the silk tax. The physical infrastructure of the empire was designed to facilitate trade while simultaneously controlling it. There was no free trade on the Silk Road, there was only protected trade. The Parthians understood that the road was a resource, and like water, it had to be channeled and taxed. In a dark armory, a blacksmith hammers a red-hot iron scale into a suit of horse armor. Between the Han and the Parthians lay the Kushan Empire, a multi-ethnic power that spanned from the Aral Sea down into northern India. The Kushans were the physical bridge between the cultures of the East and the West. Their territory included the critical mountain passes of the Hindu Kush and the fertile plains of the Indus River. Their role in the Silk Road was that of the integrator. They were the first to issue gold coinage modeled after Roman denarii, but featuring Chinese and Indian motifs, creating a standardized physical medium for exchange across thousands of miles. This was the engineering of a global currency. The Kushans controlled the Khyber Pass, the primary gateway into the Indian subcontinent. This pass is a narrow, 50-kilometer-long slit in the mountains, where the rock walls rise almost vertically. To secure this route, the Kushans built a series of high-altitude forts that monitored every movement. Their military was a hybrid force, combining the heavy cavalry of the north with the elephant corps of the south. This diversity allowed them to project power into different terrains, from the freezing mountain peaks to the humid jungles of the Ganges. They were the masters of the clash of ecosystems, and they leveraged this to control the flow of spices, gems, and silk. The logistics of the Kushan Empire were centered on the city of Begram, where archaeologists have found treasure rooms filled with goods from across the known world: Roman glass, Indian ivory carvings, and Chinese lacquered boxes. These were not just luxury items. They were samples of the global inventory that moved through Kushan territory. The Kushans didn't just move goods. They moved ideas through the physical transportation of statues and religious icons. This was the period when Buddhism began its trek toward China, carried not by wandering monks alone, but as cargo along the trade routes, supported by the wealth of the merchant guilds. The physical reality of Kushan trade was the monsoon engine. By controlling the ports of the Indus Delta, the Kushans tapped into the maritime Silk Road. They understood the seasonal physics of the Indian Ocean, how the winds blew toward India in the summer and toward Africa and Arabia in the winter. They coordinated land caravans with sea arrivals, creating a multimodal transport system. This required precise timing. If a caravan missed the monsoon winds, the goods would sit in a warehouse for 6 months, consuming capital and risking rot. The Kushans were the first to master the synchronization of global trade. The Kushan Empire was a society built on the move. Even their kings traveled in massive mobile camps, moving between summer and winter capitals to stay ahead of the weather and maintain personal control over their governors. This mobility was reflected in their art, small, portable objects made of gold and precious stones. Their power was not rooted in a single city, but in the physical control of the arteries of trade. They were the connective tissue of the Silk Road. As the sun sets over the Indus, a Kushan official presses a heavy gold ring into a slab of warm clay to authorize a shipment of pepper. At the far western end of the Silk Road sat Rome, a consumer powerhouse with an insatiable hunger for the exotic. By the 1st century CE, silk had become more than a luxury. It was a physical marker of rank and a tool of political theater. The Roman elite spent millions of sesterces every year on a material they didn't know how to produce. They believed silk grew on trees or was harvested from the hair of desert tribes. This ignorance was a physical advantage for the middlemen, who kept the source of the fiber a closely guarded secret. The Roman economy was physically linked to a source thousands of miles away, a dependency that created a massive trade deficit. The logistics of the Roman end of the Silk Road centered on the Limes Arabicus, the desert frontier. Goods arriving from the Parthian Empire or via the Red Sea were funneled into hub cities like Palmyra and Petra. These were caravan cities, built in the middle of the desert around miraculous water sources. Petra was an engineering marvel, with its monumental architecture carved directly into the red sandstone cliffs and a sophisticated system of terracotta pipes that brought water to every corner of the city. The city was a physical trap for wealth, a place where the desert exhausted itself and the Mediterranean began. Palmyra served as the customs house of the Roman East. Its merchants operated their own private fleets and camel caravans, reaching as far as the Persian Gulf. The Palmyrene tariff, a massive stone inscription found in the city, lists the exact physical tax for every type of cargo: a load of slaves, a bale of purple-dyed silk, a crate of dried perfumes. This was the mechanics of the market. The city's wealth was visible in its colonnaded streets and massive temples, all funded by the protection racket of the desert trade. The air in Palmyra smelled of salt, sweat, and the expensive resins of the Arabian Peninsula. The physical transportation of silk within the Roman Empire was a massive undertaking. Once it reached the ports of Antioch or Alexandria, it was often unraveled and rewoven with linen or wool to make it go further, or dyed with Tyrian purple, a pigment extracted from thousands of crushed murex snails. This was an industrial process that required specialized factories and vast amounts of labor. The resulting fabric was so valuable that it was weighed against gold. A single silk robe could cost the equivalent of a soldier's salary for several years. This was the physical manifestation of Roman excess, a thin layer of fabric that stretched the empire's resources to the breaking point. To secure their supply, the Romans attempted to bypass the Parthian middlemen by developing maritime routes through the Red Sea. They utilized the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a physical guidebook that detailed the ports, the winds, and the goods of the Indian Ocean. This was the maritime bypass, an engineering solution to a political problem. They built massive Leontophoros ships, floating warehouses that could carry hundreds of tons of cargo. But the sea was just as dangerous as the desert, with pirates and reefs replacing raiders and dunes. The Roman hunger for silk forced the empire to expand its physical reach further than it ever intended. A Roman merchant on the docks of Berenike watches as a crate of cinnamon is winched from a ship's hold. Trade on the Silk Road was never free. It was a purchased safety. The protection racket was the fundamental economic model of the route. From the Han watchtowers to the Parthian checkpoints, every mile of the road was owned by someone with a weapon. For a merchant, the cost of doing business included the escort fee. This was a physical exchange of wealth for security. Without it, a caravan was merely a slow-moving pile of loot. The mechanics of this protection involved a complex network of local chieftains, mercenary bands, and imperial garrisons, all of whom required a cut of the profits to keep the road open. The architecture of protection was visible in the fortified caravanserai. Unlike the urban oases, these were isolated outposts built in the middle of nowhere. They featured high, windowless walls, a single defensible entrance, and towers at each corner. They were designed to hold out against a siege for weeks if necessary. Inside, the division of space was strictly functional: stalls for animals, storage for goods, and a small, heavily guarded treasury. These forts were the batteries of the Silk Road, providing the energy and safety needed to reach the next node. The sound of the night was the clatter of iron-shod boots on stone battlements as guards changed shifts. Logistics also included the intelligence network. Protection was not just about walls, it was about information. Scouts were paid to monitor the movement of nomadic tribes and the state of distant water holes. This information was moved via fire signals and fast horse couriers, the Pony Express of the ancient world. A signal fire lit on a ridge in the Pamirs could reach the capital in a matter of days, warning of an invasion or a closed pass. This was the data layer of the Silk Road, a physical system of light and speed that allowed empires to react to threats before they arrived at the city gates. The weapons of protection were specialized for the terrain. The Chinese used the repeating crossbow, a mechanical marvel that could fire 10 bolts in 15 seconds, allowing a small garrison to create a wall of flying iron. The Persians used the recurved bow, which had a draw weight of over 100 pounds and could pierce armor at 200 paces. These were the tools that enforced the Pax Serica and the Pax Parthica. The road was only as safe as the weapons that guarded it. A merchant didn't pray for safety. He paid for it in hard currency and reliable steel. The physical reality of a protection failure was catastrophic. The ruins of caravans found in the Gobi Desert show the results of a failed escort: broken crates, scattered bones, and silk that has turned to dust. When an empire collapsed, the protection vanished, and the road closed. This happened repeatedly throughout history: when the Han fell, when the Kushans were absorbed, when the Romans retreated. The road was a living thing that required constant feeding by the military. Without the soldier, the merchant was a ghost. A mercenary sharpens his short sword by the embers of a dying fire, the rasp of the whetstone the only sound in the desert night. To the north of the Silk Road lay the Great Steppe, a vast ocean of grass that acted as both a highway and a barrier. This was the domain of the nomads, the Xiongnu, the Turks, and the Mongols. Their relationship with the Silk Road was purely parasitic and predatory. They did not build cities, they built mobile empires. Their logistics were based on the horse and the sheep. A nomadic army carried its own food supply in the form of livestock, allowing them to move at speeds that were impossible for settled empires. The steppe was the high-speed lane of the Silk Road, but it was a lane where the toll was often blood. The engineering of the steppe was biological. The Mongolian pony was a small, incredibly tough animal that could survive by digging through snow to find grass. A nomadic warrior often had 5 or 6 horses, allowing him to rotate them and ride for days without stopping. This biological logistics gave the nomads a tactical advantage of mobility and surprise. They could strike a caravan and vanish into the grass before a garrison could even light a signal fire. The Silk Road had to adapt to this by creating buffer zones, belts of fortified farmland designed to slow down nomadic incursions. The steppe was also the source of the road's most valuable non-silk commodity, the horse. The trade was a literal silk for horses exchange. The Chinese needed the horses for their military, and the nomads needed the silk to trade for grain and manufactured goods. This was a physical exchange of energy. The nomadic tribes became the logistics providers for the northern routes, hiring out their animals and their knowledge of the terrain. They were the masters of the open road, moving between the summer and winter pastures and bringing the news and the goods of the world with them. The physical reality of the steppe was the yurt or dar. These were portable dwellings made of felt and wood, designed to be packed onto a wagon in less than an hour. A nomadic city was a city of wagons, a mobile logistics hub that could move hundreds of miles in a single season. This mobility made them almost impossible to conquer. When the Han or the Persians sent armies into the steppe, the nomads simply retreated, leading the invaders deeper into the grass until their supply lines collapsed. The steppe was a physical maze where the walls were made of distance and hunger. The scent of the steppe was the smell of crushed grass and fermented mare's milk. The interaction between the steppe and the Silk Road reached its peak with the rise of the Turkic Khaganates. They became the ultimate power brokers, controlling the northern routes and demanding tribute from both China and Byzantium. They didn't just tax the trade, they participated in it, sending their own caravans deep into the west. They used silk as a physical currency to pay their vassals and by the loyalty of their generals. The Silk Road had turned the nomads from raiders into merchant warriors. In the center of a vast grassland, a horseman pulls a heavy felt cover over his wagon, bracing for a sudden storm. By the 7th century, the physical limitations of the land routes, the mountains, the deserts, and the constant threat of raids, forced a massive shift toward the sea. This was the birth of the maritime Silk Road. While a camel could carry 500 pounds, a dhow or a junk could carry 50 tons. The physics of buoyancy were simply more efficient than the physics of overland travel. The maritime route bypassed the Parthian curtain and the Pamir Knot, connecting the ports of southern China directly to the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. This was a revolution in volume and scale. The engineering of the maritime route was centered on the dhow and the junk. The Arab dhow used a lateen sail, a triangular sail that allowed it to tack against the wind. This was a breakthrough in naval mechanics, allowing ships to navigate the unpredictable winds of the Indian Ocean. The Chinese junk featured multiple masts and watertight compartments, an engineering innovation that prevented a single leak from sinking the entire vessel. These ships were the heavy-lift cranes of the ancient world, moving mountains of ceramics, spices, and tea that would have been impossible to transport by land. The logistics of the sea were governed by the monsoon clock. In the Indian Ocean, the winds blow from the northeast from October to April, and from the southwest from May to September. A merchant had to synchronize his entire supply chain with these physical cycles. A ship leaving Guangzhou in the winter would arrive in India just in time to catch the summer winds toward the Persian Gulf. If you missed the window, you were stuck in port for 6 months, paying for dockage and watching your cargo rot. The maritime Silk Road was a game of planetary logistics, where the engine was the atmosphere itself. The ports of the maritime route, Guangzhou, Malacca, Guilin, and Siraf, became the new hubs of global wealth. These were massive industrial zones where goods were unloaded, processed, and repacked. The physical evidence of this trade is still found on the ocean floor. Shipwrecks filled with thousands of pieces of Changsha porcelain, still stacked in their original wooden crates. This was the mass production phase of the Silk Road. Trade was no longer about a few bales of silk. It was about the bulk movement of household goods for a global market. The air in these ports was a thick fog of salt spray, rotting fish, and the sweet scent of cloves. The maritime shift did not kill the land routes, but it forced them to specialize. The overland path became the route for high-value, urgent goods and the movement of political embassies, while the sea became the highway for the global economy. The land was the nervous system. The sea was the digestive tract. This dual-track system created a physical web that encircled the known world. As the land routes fractured under the weight of new empires, the sea lanes remained open, driven by the inexorable logic of the wind and the wave. On a crowded pier in Malacca, a harbor master records the weight of a shipment of peppercorns on a wooden tally stick. As the Silk Road reached its technological peak, the most significant cargo was not fabric or spice, but the information infrastructure. The movement of paper technology from China to the West is one of the most transformative logistical events in history. According to legend, the secret was captured at the Battle of Talas in 751 CE, when Arab forces defeated a Tang Dynasty army and took Chinese papermakers as prisoners of war. The physical reality was likely more gradual, but the result was a revolution in the mechanics of government and trade. Paper was lighter than parchment and cheaper than silk, making it the perfect medium for the paper trail that would soon manage the world. The engineering of paper production required a massive investment in hydraulic machinery. To grind the rags and wood pulp needed for the slurry, paper mills were built along the rivers of Samarkand and Baghdad. These mills used water wheels to drive heavy hammers, a physical application of energy that allowed for the mass production of the material. This was the first industrial secret to move across the Silk Road. The availability of paper allowed for the creation of massive libraries and the standardization of law and commerce. It was the software that allowed the hardware of the Silk Road to function at a higher level of complexity. Alongside paper moved gunpowder. Originally a byproduct of alchemical experiments in China, gunpowder was first moved along the Silk Road as a physical curiosity, fire medicine. But its military potential was quickly realized. The logistics of gunpowder warfare required the movement of sulfur and saltpeter, chemicals that had to be mined and refined in specific locations. This created a new strategic resource trade. The Silk Road became the conduit for the evolution of the fire lance and the early cannon. The physical reality of power was shifting from the strength of the archer's arm to the chemical energy of the powder. The physical transportation of these technologies was a slow-motion leak. You could lock a gate, but you couldn't lock an idea that was carried in the minds of captured craftsmen or described in a merchant's notebook. The Silk Road acted as a global diffusion machine, evening out the technological landscape of the planet. By the time gunpowder reached the West, it had been refined and improved by every culture it passed through. Persian engineers, Mongol tacticians, and European smiths. The road was the laboratory where the modern world was forged. The scent of this era was the acrid tang of sulfur and the earthy smell of damp paper pulp. This technological exchange was not a clash of civilizations, but a merging of mechanics. The physical objects that moved, the paper scrolls, the bronze bombards, the magnetic compasses, were the tools that would eventually make the Silk Road itself obsolete. By giving the West the tools of navigation and the power of gunpowder, the Silk Road was unintentionally engineering its own destruction. The ancient superhighway was carrying the seeds of the Age of Discovery. At a mill in Samarkand, a worker lifts a wooden frame covered in a thin layer of wet fiber, the water dripping back into the stone vat. In the 13th century, the Silk Road was forcibly unified under the Mongol Empire. This was the Pax Mongolica, a period where the entire route from the Pacific to the Black Sea was under a single military command. The Mongols did not just protect the road, they engineered it for maximum speed. They established the YAM system, a brutal and efficient postal and supply network. Every 20 to 30 miles, there was a relay station stocked with hundreds of fresh horses and grain. A Mongol messenger, using a system of bells to announce his arrival, could cover 200 miles in a single day. This was the broadband of the 13th century. The logistics of the Mongol army were a masterpiece of efficiency. They moved as a horde, a massive self-sustaining ecosystem of soldiers, families, and millions of animals. They didn't rely on supply lines, they were the supply line. They used dehydrated milk and cured meat to feed their troops on the move, and their engineers, captured from China and Persia, built bridges and siege engines on the fly. The physical reality of Mongol power was the ability to project a massive force across an entire continent faster than any previous empire. They turned the Silk Road into a military conveyor belt. The Mongols treated trade as a strategic asset. They issued the peza, a physical passport made of gold, silver, or iron, that gave the bearer the right to fresh horses and protection throughout the empire. To harm a traveler with a peza was to invite the total destruction of your city. This physical guarantee of safety led to a surge in trade and travel. This was the world that Marco Polo encountered, a world where a merchant could carry a tablet of authority and walk from Italy to Beijing without fear of raid or ransom. The mechanics of the road had reached their absolute peak of efficiency. But this efficiency had a physical dark side. The same high-speed network that moved silk and spices also moved biological cargo. The Black Death, the bubonic plague, utilized the Silk Road as its primary vector. The bacteria, carried by fleas on rats that nested in the grain sacks of the caravans and the holds of the ships, moved across the continent with terrifying speed. The Yam system, designed for messengers, became a highway for the plague. The physical reality of the Silk Road was now the path of the pandemic. The scent of the late Mongol era was the smell of incense burned to ward off the foul air of the dying. The Mongol Empire eventually fractured, but the logistical standards they set remained. They had shown that a single system could manage the world. But the physical cost was too high, and the biological blowback too severe. The road began to contract. The Great Wall was rebuilt by the Ming Dynasty, not as a gate, but as a seal. The era of the open steppe was ending. In a silent valley in the Crimea, a Genoese merchant watches as the last ship of the season pulls away from the pier, unaware of the silent killer hidden in its cargo. By the 15th century, the Silk Road was physically breaking apart. The collapse of the Mongol Empire had replaced a single unified authority with a dozen warring khanates and sultanates. The protection racket had become too expensive. Each local ruler demanded their own toll, making the overland journey economically ruinous. Simultaneously, the rise of the Ottoman Empire in the west created a geopolitical wall. The Ottomans controlled the western terminuses of the Silk Road and taxed the trade so heavily that the Europeans were forced to look for an alternative. The ancient superhighway was being choked by its own mechanics. The physical reality of this decline was visible in the ruination of the hubs. Cities like Samarkand and Merv, which had been the shining centers of the world, began to shrink. The Karai systems fell into disrepair as the central authorities could no longer fund the thousands of laborers needed to clear the silt. The sand, which had been held back for 1,000 years by the sheer force of human will, began to move back in. The ghost cities of the Darim Basin were joined by the ghost cities of the Iranian plateau. The Silk Road was literally being buried alive. Engineering shifted from the desert to the shipyard. In the west, the caravel was developed, a ship designed for the deep ocean, capable of surviving the Atlantic and rounding the tip of Africa. This was the maritime bypass on a global scale. When Vasco da Gama reached India by sea in 1498, the land routes were doomed. The cost of moving a ton of pepper by sea was a fraction of the cost of moving it by land. The physics of the ocean had finally defeated the physics of the desert. The Silk Road didn't fail. It was simply outcompeted by a more efficient machine. The logistics of the Age of Discovery were based on the factory system, fortified trading posts established by European powers along the coasts of Africa and Asia. These were the new oases, but they were accessible only by water. The physical focus of the world shifted from the heartland of Eurasia to the rimland of the oceans. The interior of the continent became a logistical dead zone, a place of high risk and low reward. The great empires of the Silk Road, the Timurids, the Mughals, the Safavids, found themselves cut off from the global flow of wealth. The scent of the era was the smell of wet timber and the ozone of an approaching Atlantic storm. The Silk Road began to exist only in the form of residue. The techniques of weaving, the recipes for medicine, and the technologies of gunpowder and paper were now permanent parts of global culture, but the physical path that brought them was closing. The great stone caravanserai were converted into stables or left to crumble. The heavenly horses were no longer needed for war. They were replaced by the iron horse of the cannon and the sea horse of the galleon. The world was shrinking, and the Silk Road was the first casualty of the new scale. A lone shepherd leads his flock through the crumbling archway of a forgotten fortress. Today, the Silk Road exists as a landscape of industrial archaeology. In the deserts of Xinjiang, the ruins of the watchtowers still stand, their sun-dried bricks honeycombed by centuries of wind erosion. In the mountains of Tajikistan, the narrow staircase roads can still be traced along the cliffs, a physical record of the desperation and ambition of ancient traders. These are not just monuments. They are the skeletons of the first global machine. The physical reality of the Silk Road is a layer of dust and iron that covers a third of the Earth's surface. The New Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative, is a modern engineering project that follows the exact same physical logic as the Han expansion. It is a quest for resources and the projection of power through infrastructure. Instead of camel caravans, it uses high-speed rail. Instead of Karai's tunnels, it uses fiber optic cables and oil pipelines. But the physics of the route remain the same. It is still a battle against distance, a struggle to secure supply lines through hostile territory, and a massive investment in the mechanics of connection. The ghost of the ancient superhighway is being resurrected in steel and concrete. The logistics of the modern world are still haunted by the ancient bottlenecks. The Khyber Pass and the Strait of Malacca are still the most strategic points on the planet. The protection racket has evolved into global security agreements and naval task forces, but the goal is identical: the safe movement of cargo from one side of the world to the other. The Silk Road was the prototype for the just-in-time delivery system that defines our modern life. It was the first time humanity attempted to conquer the physical constraints of the planet on a global scale. The physical remains of the Silk Road are being reclaimed by the earth. The silk that once cost a mountain of gold has long since rotted away, but the jade and the iron remain. In the silence of the Taklamakan, you can still find the shards of Roman glass and the bronze arrowheads of the Han, buried under a few inches of shifting sand. These objects are the data points of a story that lasted 2,000 years, a story of how the world was physically stitched together by the grit of the traveler and the will of the emperor. The scent of the desert remains unchanged, the smell of sun-scorched earth and the promise of water just over the horizon. The story of the Silk Road is not a story of ideas, but of work. It is the story of the millions of hours of labor spent digging wells, building walls, and driving animals across the most dangerous terrain on Earth. It was a physical triumph over the void. As the sun sets over the ruins of Palmyra, the shadows of the great columns stretch out across the sand, pointing toward the east. In a museum in Xi'an, a technician carefully brushes the dust from a 2,000-year-old horse bit, the iron still cold to the touch.